Box Dance presents.
Hello and welcome back to Dance Behind the Screen podcast, Social Injustice, Black Lives Matter and Dance miniseries, part 2. And I'm one of your co-hosts, Reyna and Martheya.
I'm Zaria.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Martheya.
So today I was really excited for Reyna and Martheya to interview Tim Wise. I'm not in on this one, but I think it's important for there to be non-Black spaces so that learning can happen without necessarily having too much of a burden on the Black people who've been doing this for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually heard Tim Wise speak when I was in undergrad. He came as a guest to my college. I have a book signed by him, and I thought that he would be a really great resource for people who want to be allies and to learn from another person who's been doing a lot of the work. And I'm sure he also told you all to kind of shift your focus to Black leaders as well.
Yeah, for sure. It was a really wonderful conversation. He also mentioned to us his relationship to dance is very connected to his daughters and how he was able to take that, learn a little bit more about that, and kind of implement that into the podcast. So that was really exciting.
Yeah, his daughters actually helped him in preparing for the conversation tailored to the dance community. Yeah, and Zaria, I think, like what his advice that you'll hear also in the episode was to really look to Black people as the leaders in this conversation, even though, he's been working on anti-racism in America and has written several books and things like that. A lot of his advice did circle back to that point. And I just want to personally, thank you, Azaria, for being the leader and leading us through all of these conversations for No Box Dance, because, especially in starting this mini series and really focusing on Black Lives Matter, we do acknowledge the pressure that you're under, especially as a Black woman. And I just want to really thank you for really taking the time to, have those conversations with me, with Reyna, with Yejin, just like always being there, because I know that, not only from us, but there's so many other people looking to you. And I just want to publicly say thank you and just how grateful we are to have you on our team, because you really have spearheaded and led a lot of these conversations.
I love you guys.
Love you. So before we get into a little bit more about who Tim Wise is, similarly to our previous episode with Paloma, we do think it's important that we take time to pause and have a moment of silence for those that we've lost. And we just want to offer the message that it's okay to take the time to pause. So with that, we want to, again, honor the memory of those that we've lost. So we invite you to join us in a moment of silence after we share the names.
Dominique Fells.
Tony McDade.
Marsha P. Johnson.
Rhea Milton.
Trayvon Martin.
Jordan Edwards.
Nina Pop.
Monica Diamond.
Sandra Bland.
Walter Scott.
Ahmed Arbery.
Yvette Smith.
Laquan McDonald.
Jeremy Reed.
Natasha McKenna.
And Eric Harris.
So again, we invite you to join us in 1 minute of silence in honor of their memory. Thank you, guys.
So, who is Tim Wise?
Yes. Reyna, you want to share a little bit about Tim?
All right, so Tim Wise is among the most prominent anti-racist essayists and educator in the U.S. He has spent the past 25 years speaking to audience in all 50 states on over 1,500 college and high school campuses, hundreds of professional and academic conferences, and to community groups across the nation. Wise is the author of 7 books, including his highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from Privileged Son, as well as a Dear White American, Letter to a New Minority. His forthcoming book, Dispatches from the Race War, will be released in December 2020. And one more thing, he has a few documentaries that you should totally check out.
And I also want to encourage you guys listening to check out his podcast on Patreon, Speak Out with Tim Wise. He has a recent episode that talks specifically about systemic racism, which I think is super important, especially if you are looking for an education in terms of how this is played out in the economy and things like that. So just looking at racism at a much larger scale. Yeah, it's a really great conversation. Before we get into the episode, I did want to share a quote that he shared actually in his book, Dear White America. And this is the close of the book. And this is a quote by James Baldwin. Any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, the end of safety. And at such a moment, unable to see and not daring to imagine what the future will now bring forth, one clings to what one knew or dreamed that one possessed. Yet, it is only when a man is able, without bitterness or self-pity, to surrender a dream he has long cherished or a privilege he has long possessed, that he is set free. He has set himself free for higher dreams, for greater privileges. Well, Tim, welcome to our show. We're really excited to have you here. There's a lot of important conversations that we're hoping to have with you, for you to just shed some light, your area of expertise supporting anti-racism in America. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So for those who are listening who might just now be waking up to the discrimination and injustice in the United States, and more specifically in the dance world, and want to help, how would you guide them?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important for people to be guided first and foremost by those who have been most affected. So I don't think it's my job, as a white guy to guide folks through that process, but I can certainly help as a white person in the work, helping to bring other white folks along in particular to see some of the things that I see, which are things that people of color have shared with me, and particularly Black folks who have been some of my strongest mentors over the years. So I certainly will play a supportive role. But I think ultimately it's really about listening to those voices that we were trained not to listen to, whether those are scholars, whether those are artists, whomever. I mean, we have been trained in the culture not really to value the voices of Black and brown peoples, just as we have been trained not to value the voices of women, just as we have been trained not to value the voices of poor and working class people, of LGBTQ folks, of any marginalized people. And so part of it is being humble enough. I think the first part is being humble enough to acknowledge all the things that you don't know. And then rather than getting stuck in that place of shame around that, because I do sense a lot of that happening right now, where people sort of feel bad about how blind they were to what was going on. But look, you're supposed to not see it. I mean, that's the genius of this system, right? Is that it doesn't ask of you any knowledge. In fact, we come by this helplessness and this obliviousness very, very honestly. So if the schools haven't trained us correctly, if our parents weren't trained correctly, so they can't help in many cases, if the politicians have no interest in being honest, if every sort of venue of our culture is sort of encouraging an obliviousness, why would we expect that we would actually get it? I mean, it's actually more of a miracle when we do. So That's not to let us off the hook for being ignorant at all. We still have to take responsibility for it, but it's just about saying, that beating yourself up for inheriting the obliviousness that you were literally handed as a present by the society is not going to be very helpful, because it was given to you very deliberately.
I think that's an important point. I guess I know I'm struggling with too as a white woman, in realizing, my perspective in this, and how can we acknowledge that and then move forward from that. I know I'm really interested in kind of some of these actionable steps that we can take as white people, as people of color, just as people that are in this world that we're living in right now. I guess, what would you suggest is the starting point for actually taking steps towards action? I do think, having these conversations is definitely a starting point, and that's what we want to do as a part of our podcast platform, is really uncover and unpack and uplift people through conversations. So bringing attention to what exists, just like what you were just talking about, acknowledging that this is a part of the culture, right? So I guess, my question to you is, and now what? What would you recommend?
So I think there's sort of three parts to it, and they can be done simultaneously. They're best if they're done simultaneously, but I know that sometimes it's easier said than done, depending on where you live and sort of, who's in your immediate circle. But I think first thing that we can definitely do, all of us, and I think white folks especially need to do it, because people of color have probably done this quite a bit, but everybody can stand to do it more, is to really take inventory of how racialized our lives are, so that we're very clear on the centrality of race in our lives. It's very easy to think, when you look at the news and you see a racial issue bubbling up, like police brutality, or you see something like inequality in healthcare and COVID-19 and the disparities there, to think that race, it's an issue. It's an issue we should address. Well, that's one way of looking at it, but really racism and racial inequity is foundational to everything in the country. So it's systematized throughout all of these things, which means that no matter what your area, a lot of people, are really passionate about environmental issues, or they're really passionate about healthcare access, or they're really passionate about making the schools better for everyone. And those are great things to care about, and they're great things to be active around. But what we need to do is bring a lens to that, which acknowledges how those issues are themselves connected to race. So if I want to do healthcare reform work, great, but I need to understand the racialized nature of the healthcare delivery system and the way that racism actually affects the health of Black and brown people. So that means taking some inventory, even of my own activism, my own work that I do. If I'm an environmentalist and I do great, work on climate change and warming and toxicity in the water and the air and the soil, I need to understand the way that people of color are disproportionately affected by unclean air and unclean water and toxic waste and warming around the globe, so that I can make that work also intentional, right? So number one is taking inventory of even the stuff that I already do to make sure that I understand the connection to race, and also taking inventory of my own racialized life. A lot of times white folks come to this work and we think racism is, Black folks' issue, or it's, Latinx folks' issue, or it's just people of color, it's their thing. And maybe we can sort of support them and we'll show up at the rally, but it's not really central to us. We can sort of check in and check out. And right now we're checked in, but the problem is, if you think of it that way, you could check out, next week. So how do you not do that? Well, the way you don't do that is you actually acknowledge, or you think, and you take inventory. And I mean, literally, like I'm talking, get out a pen and pad, or if you're, the technical, I'm 52. So for me, I handwrite stuff, but younger people might be like doing it on a computer or on a pad or something, whatever. And actually think about all the ways that race has played a role in your life, even in ways that maybe you hadn't thought of before. And that's everything from your social circle to who lives in your neighborhood versus who doesn't, to who your parents' friends and connections are, to where they work, to where they're from, to where they went to school. And when you trace out this sort of racial autobiography, you begin to realize that race isn't just affecting those people over there, quote unquote, it's also affecting us. And so now it's our issue too, right? It's not, or really it's not just an issue. It's something we have to deal with just in order to live with integrity. So that's the first step, personal inventory of one's own life and work. The second step is you obviously need to learn from those who are the targets of that systemic oppression. That means reading the books, especially written by peoples of color. So sure, I mean, I've written 7 books. I want people to read them, but I also, insist that people need to read Carol Anderson and need to read Ibram Kendi and need to read folks of color who have done such incredible work. I have this, you can see on the video, I've got this big, huge bookshelf behind me filled with books about race. I've read most of them. I'm not going to say I've read all of them, but they're overwhelmingly Black and brown folks because that's the source of the wisdom. I can have certain insights, but none of my insights are purely my own unless they're about my own life. They're informed, right, by the scholarship of and the art and the work of people of color. So make sure that we're reading and listening and watching videos and amplifying those voices in our social media and that kind of stuff. And then the third piece is relational. And I think ultimately, if we don't get to this part, we're not completing the circle. Some of us are lucky. I grew up in the South, and as a Southerner, I would argue, and there are some who aren't from the South who don't understand this. I think Southerners understand this. If you grow up in the South, the odds are incredibly good. In spite of how backwards our racial politics have been historically, we also have proximity to one another, white and Black, for instance, that many white folks in other parts of the country don't have. And so we're actually more likely to have the relational connection to other people. Now, it's not on a level of equality, for sure. It's not on a level of always directness and honesty. But to grow up in the South is to know that race is in the room, so to speak. Whereas I think I could grow up in the Northeast or maybe the West Coast, and even though race is in that room too, I have the luxury of not knowing it. Whereas white Southerners, we don't. So we have these connections. I was very lucky as a kid. I was growing up in the 70s and then in the 80s, but in the early 70s, I was put into a preschool program at a historically Black college by my mom. She wanted me to have an experience where I wasn't the norm. And this is 1972. So this is, integration really has just started in the Nashville school system right before I'm about to start. And so she's wanting to give me an experience. And also, I had Black women as my mentors and teachers in that program at Tennessee State. Most of the kids were Black. The women that ran the program were Black. So I'm learning at 3 and 4 years old, right, to follow Black authority, to trust Black authority, to not always be the norm in the room. That's a relational experience, which meant that 20 years later or so, when I was working in New Orleans as a community organizer in public housing, I'm being led around by women of color. They're the ones telling me what's going on in their community. They're the ones who I'm working with. I'm not working for them. I'm working with them, and they're really the leaders. I'm learning from them because I was taught at 4 to trust Black women, in particular Black authority, the authority of Black women. I don't think most white people have an experience, certainly not at 4 years old, where they're subordinated to Black authority, like really subordinated. Now, how do we create that? If you didn't have that experience, how can you create that for your kids, for instance, right? Well, think about it. You can try to make sure that if possible, that if they play on ball teams or if they are dancers, that they have choreographers, that they have teachers, that they have coaches, that they have mentors in their lives who are people of color, that it's not just a studio, let's say, if we're talking about dancers, that is just white kids and just white choreographers and just, white teachers. And so for our girls who are both dancers, the first company that they were in, and they were in it for many, many years. And one of the most important formative things in their life was that one of the 2 main choreographers was not only Black, but a Black man. To have an African-American male figure of authority as one of your main choreographers is huge when you're a 6 or 7-year-old or 8-year-old or 9-year-old white kid. And so trying to seek out these opportunities, not just for like surface level connection, right? Because we can all say, oh, I've got a Black neighbor, or I've got an Asian colleague or whatever. That's not the point, right? It's about having someone who is a person of color who is an authority, right? That could be a teacher. So it could be, I went to schools where I had lots of teachers who were Black women as well, not just Tennessee State, but even like when I was in elementary school. So I know that's not always easy depending on where you live. Like if you live in an incredibly white space where you're not even remotely close to such settings, I realize that can be harder. So that relational piece may come after the other 2, after the inventory and after the reading and the learning. But if there's any way possible to create more connected space where you're actually learning from authority figures in your life to whom you're accountable, right? When my kids are dancing with that choreographer, there's an accountability there. Like they have to do the work or they will get called out. If you have a coach, a baseball coach, a football coach, whatever it is, soccer coach, who's a person of color, like there's an accountability there. And that's where you learn to follow leadership. And so I think that's the key piece. Some people it's easier to create depending on where they live, but I think we should all strive for that kind of thing.
That makes me wonder what the accountability looks like. A white coach versus a person of color who's coaching. What do you see the difference looking like there?
I think it's an experienced difference for the kid, let's say, who's got a coach or a mentor, a choreographer, who's a person of color. And the reason is, I think that for most white kids, and not even just for white kids, I think for kids of color too, if they're growing up, let's say in the dance world, and most of their choreographers and most of the people that are in the dance world who are in authority positions, if they're comp kids, the people that run the competitions, if they're in a ballet company, the people they see who are running those companies most of the time are white. And if that's what you see, then you are internalizing a message of capacity, right? You're internalizing a notion of who is capable of leading me in this, who is capable of teaching me this kind of dance, who is capable of exercising authority, and who do I have to answer to? And so even though the term accountability may or may not be used in that whole process, I'm not sure that like when our kids had this choreographer I'm talking about that we ever used the term like accountability, but it's implied, right? You are responsible for keeping that formation up, or you're responsible for hitting that move, or you're responsible for whatever it is you're being asked to do, right? So if my kids were early on learning hip hop from this man and there were things that they could not do, and like they would get called out for that, and they would get good corrections, and they would be told how to do it, but there was still that sense of like, I'm letting that person down. And it's not just that I'm letting my choreographer or my coach or my teacher or my mentor down, like I'm letting this person down who I know is a Black man in America, and that means something. And of course, in our kids' case, like they grew up in my house, they were going to know that means something. And I'm not sure that every white kid is growing up in a house that's talking about race as much as we were. But like, even if you didn't talk about it, like this is a person who has authority. I don't want to disappoint them. They are in charge. And historically, that has not been the relationship within the dance community or within the society as a whole. So to have a kid at an early age learn that is huge. And if you haven't had that and you grow up in the activity for 15 years without anything like that, by the time you get into the latter years of high school, or maybe you're in a company that you've never had authority figures of color, you might have had dancers of color that you dance with, but all the authority figures were white. There's a subtle subconscious thing that you're internalizing about who has the capacity. Because keep in mind, in this society, we're all told that wherever you end up is all about your effort, right? We have this notion of rugged individualism and this notion of meritocracy. So if I'm running the company, it must be because I'm the best, right? And if I am in this company at this really high level, where a ballet company or whatever it might be, it's because I'm the best. There's an assumption that that's what merit is. So if you didn't make it to that level, it's because you must not have what it takes. Well, A, that's a questionable thing anyway, right? But B, when you have that mentality in a society of profound racial disparity, you're almost guaranteeing that young kids are going to grow up thinking, well, certain people are just better at dance or whatever the activity is, and certain people are just better choreographers, and certain people just really can't, be Clara or whatever in the Nutcracker or whatever the case might be, right?
Right. So then this conversation makes me think about this other thing about, with a Black Lives Matter movement happening right now and the fights that have been going on for a long time. I can't speak for any university, but I can only speak for where my mind wanders. This idea that universities are now we have to hire a person of color. Dance companies are probably thinking, well, now we have to hire people of color to be part of the company. Now we need to be more diverse in who the guest artist is. Yeah. I mean, but then is it because they want to do it, because they want to deconstruct what's been happening before, or is it, surface level, well, that's what we're going to have to do?
And
Well,
and I want to tag on to that. It seems like that's kind of a lot what's going around on social media too, is just this like performative activism and allyship. And I feel like it ties into that too. So yeah, what are your thoughts
I mean,
on
I
that?
think for some people it is going to start out as a very performative thing because again, we haven't learned anti-racist competency. Like we haven't learned how to do this right. So of course we're going to maybe do it wrong. Like no surprise, right? So if your motivation initially is sort of questionable, all right, well let's work on getting a better motivation. I'm not going to attack you for maybe not knowing that it's performative. I mean, a lot of times people think they're doing the right thing and they're like, oh, let's say hire that guest artist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well that's fine. Now let's think about why it is that you already had set the table, and
Mm-hmm.
now you invited another guest. So good for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're integrating your dinner table. But why is it that you already have the table set? You already have the meal chosen. You already know what the music's going to be, metaphorically. And the fact that you're inviting someone in, although that's a start, maybe what we need to think about is, let's reset this table and let's make sure that these people who we're now bringing in are part of the construction of the table. And they get to, and so it's not just like I'm inviting you to the dance, so to speak, but my DJ is, still going to choose the music. No, it's like, we're going to invite you to this thing and we're going to make you an integral part of reconfiguring it. Like that's a very different thing, right? And so, and I, and this isn't just the world of dance or art where this happens. This happens in every realm. I mean, I remember, as an activist years ago when the Iraq War started, I remember going to anti-war demonstrations where, the anti-war groups that were mostly white that put these things together were like, we need to get some black speakers and we need to get some, Latino speakers because we need a diverse panel of speakers. All right. Like, yes, you do. Absolutely. And you should get those people. But then the question is, how is it that you created a coalition that didn't include them in the first place? And what does that mean? And then how do we say from this point forward, we're not just going to keep our thing and bring you into it, but we're going to make a new thing. Like when I speak at colleges, I always talk about diversity efforts as sort of like, oh, we really want you to be part of our thing, but don't forget it is our thing, right? So like we're the sun and y'all are the planets, and we really appreciate how lovely you are, as you circle the sun, but don't ever forget who the sun is, right? We're the center of the universe, and we'd love it if you'd be part of our universe. Like you're really pretty out there sparkling in the sky, but don't forget whose universe it is. And so the problem with that is that means, okay, so we, in the world of dance, so we get some black artists into the universities. And maybe it's his guest artist, maybe it's his tenured faculty, maybe it's as the head of the department, whatever it might be. All of that should happen, and all of that's a big deal. But then the question is, are we still operating on the basis of sort of a colonial mentality that says, yes, we want these folks to come in, but they need to fit with our notion of what a dancer is, or of what an academic dance department looks like. And so if you're still operating under a sort of very white paradigm, a very Eurocentric paradigm about what dance is, about what the core competencies of dance happen to be, then just the fact that you brought in some black and brown bodies to fill that space, oh, and by the way, they needed to have bodies that still fit your Eurocentric conception of what the body looks like, then we're not really getting at the core of the problem, right?
So what are ways that you're suggesting to get to the core of the problem?
I think it's about interrogating from the bottom up the construction of whatever our discipline is. And I would say this to any academic department. I would say this to any career. If I was talking to people at a law firm, I would say the same thing about law. We have to interrogate the construction of law, the development of law. How did law in this country develop as an arm of white supremacy? And then if I'm saying about science, if I'm talking to a biology department, I would say, how has science been used to further white supremacy? Now, if I'm talking to dancers and I'm talking to people that are in the arts, I would say, okay, well, that's no different than any of these other institutions. It developed in a context of inequality. Let's break down what that looks like. And, you know, that's everything. I mean, at the most basic level. And I've thought about this with music a lot, and then, you know, began thinking about it with dance because I have kids that are dancers. Just the way, so if you think about music, there's this term we use. Sometimes it's just in our language, right? The term we use of classical music, very interesting phrasing, right? There's this notion of classical music, and we all know what it refers to. Well, what it refers to is European orchestral music, right? Now that is one form of classical music, but there's also classical forms of noise making, which is really what music is in all societies, in all cultures around the world, and there always has been. But when we say, well, this is classical, and here's why, and all music comes from this, well, maybe not, right? And yeah, there's a diatonic scale, but whatever. Do you actually think that other societies, maybe they had different names for that, never thought of that, or never thought of scaling? Or, I mean, and then with dance, right, it's sort of the same. Well, ballet is the core of all dance. What is ballet? Is it this intrinsic? I mean, I've watched my kids do it. Like, there's nothing inherently natural about what you have to do to your body to do ballet. It's not natural. It is a created and beautiful art form. It is classical, but it is also European folk style created. And there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't make it bad. It just means that it's not universal. It is, you know, and sort of the hallmark, Malefi Asante at Temple talks about the hallmark of Eurocentrism and thus white supremacy is universalizing the particular, right? So when you take that which is particular to a group of people, and it may be perfectly great and valid and wonderful stuff, but it's particular to them, and then you act as though it's universal and it applies to everyone the same, you have essentially made the European the human, the stand-in for a human being. So I think for dance, it's about interrogating, how have you done that? You know, how has that community done that? And what are some ways that we can begin to critique that from the ground up, not to diminish that which has been accomplished in these forms of dance, but to acknowledge that canon, just like in literature, the classic canon of literature can be fantastically valuable, but it was not objectively chosen. And it was not objectively determined that this is the classic canon. In fact, interestingly, literature-wise, many of the things that are now considered classics within the canon, anything basically written by an American author that's now considered part of the classic canon, including Mark Twain, for instance, that stuff, when it was written, was thought of by European literature. You know, it was not taught in any colleges. It was not taught in any of the sort of boarding schools and prep schools, because it was thought of as, oh, there's no American writers. There are no American writers worth knowing. It's just classic British literature. That's the classic canon. We should stick with that. Now, if you were to say that about Mark Twain, people would get, well, Mark Twain is part of the canon. Well, but he wasn't always. So how did that happen? Who made the decision? All of these decisions in art and science too, and in all they're decisions made by people conditioned in a culture, right? And so once we let go of that notion of objectivity and we start to look at how subjective the process is, all kinds of things open up to us that we might not have seen before.
Wow. That, as I find myself writing notes as we're talking about this, and I want to go back to something that you said at the very beginning, and you said the word humble. What does that humble look like as somebody who's white, I wonder? And how is that also a gate to open up to the possibilities of deconstructing all of these things?
Yeah, I think that humility is, first of all, it's not a tendency that we encourage in this culture just generally, right? Putting aside white supremacy and putting aside male domination and patriarchy and put aside the class system, like just in general, America does not encourage humility, right? The United States is very much rooted in, like, at its core, the idea that we're not just one among many nations, like we're the greatest nation ever struck off by the forehead of God, right? So when you start out with that mentality that we're this shining city on a hill, you're already looking at a country which, putting aside race and gender and sexuality and class and all the other divisions, is already about feelings of betterness. So when you grow up in that culture and you grow up in a society then that also venerates material wealth, so that's about success, not being humble. The president of the United States is sort of, you know, we can make fun of him as like a detour from normalcy, but he's like the most normal, most American president ever in some ways, because what he's doing is, and so what is he? He's a braggart. He has no humility, but neither does this country. He's a guy who brags openly about frankly abusing women. Well, that's very normal for men, sadly, in this society. He plays upon racial resentment. That's incredibly American. Like all this stuff, and the humility piece is a big part of it. No, he has no humility, but neither does America. And so in that regard, he's learned the lessons of the culture very well, and sadly, so have the rest of us. So part of the struggle that we have, and the struggle that I had, I remember early on when I started doing activism, and I was in college, and I remember there was that sense of that particularly white men, I think, grow up with, which is, you know, if you want a job done right, you just do it yourself kind of thing, right? And I think all Americans sort of grow up with that to some extent, but some of us really take it to heart, because it's like, right, I can do it better than if I just do it by myself. I've got it, you know. And white men are totally encouraged to think that way. So I would take on a lot of things that I shouldn't have been taking on, or that I certainly shouldn't have been taking on alone. And I didn't understand the lack of humility that was involved in that, the lack of ability to sort of step back. And for me, it was really only when I became a community organizer, and the things that you learn when you're going to do that work is that it's about listening a lot more than talking. It's about following a lot more than leading, that your job is to help other people understand their own power, not to use your power, right? But to help elicit from other people their own competencies that maybe they don't even realize they have. Well, a lot of the way you do that is humility and listening and discussing and creating relations and positive feedback, which marginalized people rarely get. You know, they just get feedback, and it's oftentimes not very constructive and helpful. And so what I was learning was the importance of being more humble. And I still struggle with it, because as someone who gets a lot of recognition for this work, and, you know, and I mean, I get to go around the country and give talks, and I haven't had any best-selling books, but my stuff gets read, you know, and it gets taught in colleges, and I get audiences that come to my speeches. And it's very hard when you're doing anything where you get applause or you get thank yous, or you know, now in my case, I also get death threats and hate mail. That'll keep you sort of level-headed, I guess, like not humble, but like aware that it's not all accolades and flowers, you know. But I think you have to really train yourself in this culture to be humble. And so one of the ways that I encourage people to do it is to be radically honest about how you got to wherever it is you are in life, right? So regardless of what kind of success you've had, we've all had help getting wherever it is we are, all of us, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, class. We've all had some help getting to the point where we're, you know, able to engage in this conversation or do whatever it is we do for our career. So part of it is just thinking about all the things that made that possible. Now, sometimes that's going to be about male privilege and white privilege and class privilege and straight privilege and all those things. Other times it's just going to be about luck. It's just going to be about the third grade teacher you had who encouraged you when none of the other teachers thought you were ever going to amount to anything. Or it's that coach, or it's that choreographer who stuck with you even though you were struggling, or whatever. Or it could be a parent, or it could be a friend, whatever. Everybody's got somebody. And some of us had more than others, but we've all had some help. And part of acknowledging that is to begin to realize for oneself that if any of those things in your life go differently, which could have happened, you could be that person who's sleeping under the bridge tonight. You could be that person in the shelter tonight. You could be that person who doesn't have health care as opposed to the person you are who does. You could be the person who can't afford to send your kid to college as opposed to being the one who can. And that person who's in that position could be where you are if something had gone different for them. And none of that takes away from our effort. I think we have it in our head that if we acknowledge luck, or if we acknowledge privilege, it takes away from our effort. And it doesn't. Like it doesn't take away from my great grandfather's hard work as a Jewish immigrant from Russia in the early 1900s to acknowledge that his ability to come to America in the first place when he did was about being European, because there were immigration restrictions imposed against non-Europeans from the 1880s until the 1960s. And yet he was able to come. Now, did he catch hell when he got here? Yes, because he's Jewish and he only speaks Yiddish, and but he was able to come, right? And and he worked 18 hours a day. So he was hardworking, he did all the right things, and he had some access that other people didn't have. In my case, I work sort of hard. I don't think I have the greatest work ethic. I do okay, but the reality is I'm where I am because of the people who came into my life. And some of it is definitely about race and gender, and some of it is just luck. I joke about it, but it's true. Like, I am doing anti-racism work because I happened to go to Tulane University in New Orleans. And when I graduated, a former Klan leader, David Duke, lifelong white supremacist, was running for the US Senate and then governor of Louisiana. I had friends that started the organization that was the main opposition group to him. One was a history professor and the other was a grad student friend of mine. They hired me. If I don't go to Tulane, I don't even meet those guys, let alone do I get that job. If I don't get that job, I don't build up a reputation for doing this work at the age of 23 or whatever it was, and I'm not out doing what I'm doing now. And then the bigger point is, the only reason I went to Tulane was because I was chasing a girl that went to Louisiana State. That's a true story. So if I don't know her, and I only knew her because I met her at a debate camp during the summer between junior and senior year of high school, if I go to any other debate camp, I don't even meet her, and she doesn't convince me I must go to Tulane. I had no intention of going to Tulane, but I was in love in the manner of a 17-year-old, and she said, "You got to go to Tulane." And I said, "Oh, well, of course, And I changed my whole life plan to be with her, right? And it didn't work out for either one of us, but it did, because then we got married to the people we were supposed to get married to, so it all worked out. But the point is, that's all luck, right? Anything different happens, and our lives are fundamentally different. And maybe they'd be fine, great lives, but they wouldn't be the lives we have. So part of it is just being humble enough to acknowledge that. And here's the beauty of it. When you are humble enough to acknowledge how much help you've had, and if it's been connected to race, that's important, connected to gender, class, inheritance, whatever. The beauty of it is when you're willing to share that story and tell that truth to other people, it allows them to do the same. Right? Nobody wants to go first. Nobody wants to admit they had help, right? Nobody wants to admit that there was luck, because then there's a fear that, oh, well, if our luck was good, it could get bad, and I don't want to acknowledge that. So we say things like, I don't believe in luck. Really? You believe in fate? Really? Because there's like a couple billion people on the planet right now that are dying for lack of food. I'm not quite sure how that happened based on fate. Like, I can't accept a world that, oh, well, they just die and you happen to have a really nice life. I think there's got to be, something else going on. And it's not just a matter of fate. So you have been lucky, and you have had some things that other people haven't have. And once you acknowledge it, other people can acknowledge it. And once we all start to acknowledge it, it becomes very hard to look down on anybody, right? Because how am I going to exclude you? And how am I going to justify your exclusion? And I realized I could be you where you are, and you could be me where I am. But for a few things that happened to go right in my life and maybe wrong in yours, once I have that humility, the whole world changes in the sense of what I envision, because it's harder for me to justify inequality when I realize how easily that could have been me.
Right.
What are some practice that you have every day to help you practice humility? Well, that maybe some of us could try on.
Well, being the father of a 18 and 16-year-old will do some of that, because you realize how much, for me, being around younger people, in my own kids and speaking to other young people around the country in the work that I do, helps keep me humble, because I start to realize, even with my years of experience and the putative wisdom that comes from that there's so many things that my kids see at 18 and 16 that I definitely didn't see when I was 18 and 16. So I'm impressed by that, and that's humbling. But even now, they'll see some things that I didn't see until they mention them to me. You know, and so that's humbling. I was telling you as we were prepping to record this, that that my youngest daughter, who's 16, she'll be 17 in a couple of weeks. I told her that I was going to be with you all, and she was like, oh, I got to do some research for my dad because I don't know if he knows like what to say about race and dance, you know. And of course, I've thought about this for a long time, but I was really grateful for her to do that. And so she sends me this link that she digs out last night. She's like, you got to check this out. And we started talking about it this morning, and the stuff on the list like immediately jumped out at me about the way that race and white supremacy and racism are reinforced systemically within the world of dance. And some of the stuff I thought about, and some of the stuff sort of easy stuff that I think most people would have thought about who have spent any time around dance, but other stuff was challenging. And it was challenging for my daughter too. She's like, I can't quite get my head around a few of these things, but I find it really interesting and I want to think more about it. There was just, and that was humbling. Like, first of all, that she had to explain some of the stuff to me. She'd been thinking about it. She had some ways of looking at it that were different than mine. And she's 16 years old, but she's, you know, very mindful and wise about these things, no pun intended, given our last name. And our oldest as well, like, has had these amazing insights around the movement right now, some of which I already had, others of which, you know, she's teaching me things. And so when you can learn things from people that are either your own children or considerably younger than you, which I think we all can, that's really humbling to watch. Here in Nashville, where we live, there was a big Black Lives Matter demo, like there, you know, were all over the country a couple of weeks ago, week and a half ago. And this rally, which was 10,000 people, one of the biggest, maybe the biggest demonstration that has ever happened in this city. And it was put together by 6 young women who were between the ages of like 14 and 19. And these young women did not know each other, except on social media. They met on social, and then they organized this huge rally. And it went off without a hitch, and it was this incredible thing. That's incredibly humbling, because I know that at 52, I couldn't have done that if my life depended on it, you know? And so the fact that there are all these competencies that you see in young people will definitely keep you humble, I think.
And I just want to point out too, it seems like a key point of practicing humility is just the ability to be a listener, which I think is something that I know I need to continue to work on too as a practice.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is huge for me, you know, going and being a community organizer for the 15 months that I did that work, roughly 18 months, perhaps in the mid 90s, you know, where I would go and my job, and I was used to talking, you know, and I make my living now talking. But part of what I do when I'm out in communities doing the work or giving a speech is I'll get together before my talk. I'll get together with students, usually students of color at that school, if we can schedule it. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, but I always try to meet with people first. And I meet with them so that we can talk a little bit about what they're experiencing at the school. They can tell me some things. I usually ask, you know, hey, if you had the microphone tonight and it was you that they were coming to hear, what would you need your classmates to hear, right? Because if I know a little bit about what you need them to hear, I can talk about some of that stuff, giving you full credit if you want, unless you want it to be anonymous. I'll be happy to say that, hey, this is what I'm hearing from your classmates. Sometimes they want to get credit. Sometimes they'd rather not, you know, because they don't want the blowback, but depends on the students. But always about listening and finding out sort of what's going on here that you need me to speak to, that I can be of assistance with, because I'm going to be up there for an hour and a half tonight. So I'm going to do my thing, but I want to listen to what you have to tell me first so I can do it better. And that was something, you know, that being an organizer helped me understand, because it was really about hearing from the community before I went out and shot off my mouth, you know.
So Tim, we want to be respectful of your time. And before we get into our last segment, on your website, you share a reading list. And I just want to say thanks for compiling all of these resources. I'm wondering, since our audience consists of mainly people with dance-related careers, what do you think, what are your suggestions? What books should we be reading?
Well, nothing on that list, of course, specifically speaks to the arts or to dance, but I would say, even putting that aside, that I do think there are a couple books that I think everybody should read. Ibram Kendi's last 2 books, both How to Be an Anti-Racist and also Stamped from the Beginning, are must reads. Carol Anderson's book, White Rage, is a must read.
Mm-hmm.
I would say though, and I'll tell you, I think it's a really good jumping off point for people to dive really deeply into this within the world of dance. The thing that my kid sent me last night, she digs up this amazing list of the ways that systemic racism shows up in dance. It's a piece that Alicia Mulliken, who's from Seattle, an amazing dancer and choreographer there, put together. And it's on the website of seattledances.com under their articles. And it's entitled Recognizing Systemic Racism in Dance. And Alicia Mulliken put it together. She's a Chicana choreographer and dancer and teacher in Seattle. Amazing set of bullet points, which the only thing that my daughter and I were talking about was, we wish that it was sort of like a paragraph for each of those points. But if you're a dancer, if you're in the dance world, you're not going to need the paragraph. I needed the paragraph for some of it because the references I don't necessarily know. But of course, my daughter was like, "Oh, I can tell you what that means. I can tell you what that means." And anybody who's in the world of dance will be able to read this list, and some of the recommendations and things that Mulliken is talking about are directed at educators and directors. Others of the things that she talks about, as I scroll through it right now, are directed for organizations and grant making or bodies. So it's just an incredible list, and it's the kind of thing that I think would create really good discussions within the dance world about how to change their practice.
Right.
And just as I've looked at her website, Alicia Mulliken's work is just incredible as an artist anyway, but this piece I think would be a really good place for folks to begin looking at privilege and systemic inequity and the way it operates within the world of dance, for sure.
Thank you. We actually have shared it on our Instagram stories last night, so we will make sure to link all of this in the show notes for people as well.
Well, as we head to our last segment, it's called the Flash 4, where we ask all of our guests to answer 4 questions in a flash. So, are you ready?
I think so. I'm not good at it. I'll do it.
Okay, so if you had to recommend a resource to our audience, what would it be? It can be a book, podcast.
I think Ibram Kendi's book that I mentioned a second ago, How to Be an Anti-Racist, because I think it frames what that really means better than any book that I've read. So I would start with that. Yeah.
Awesome. Question number 2. What was the first dance you saw?
I'm sure that it was the Nutcracker when I was probably 5.
Question number 3. Do you think social media has a positive influence on the dance world? Yes or no?
I think just like in every other world, it's a mixed bag. It's a tool.
And question number 4. What is your favorite social media platform? Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter?
I mean, as far as what I use the most, it's definitely Twitter. I cannot figure Instagram out. My kid had to help me. I did an Instagram live interview the other night, and I didn't know how to do it. She's like, I felt, again, that's very humbling, back to the humility question. So Twitter is mine just because it appeals to my sense as a writer, but it's also only 280 characters. And so I think YouTube potentially as a platform for diving deeper into things is fantastic. But I would say Twitter for me. Although I think the others, are probably broader in their ability to reach people if we use them correctly.
So before we wrap up, Tim, is there anything that you feel like you didn't get to speak to in our conversation that you want to add? No,
I think that was great. I mean, I think I said everything that I wanted to say. I hope it fulfilled the needs that you had. So
no, it was
definitely
fantastic. Yeah.
And thank your daughters too for their contributions in preparing you also for a dance-focused conversation.
I will definitely do that for sure.
For sure.
Thanks for taking your time to tune into Dance Behind the Screen, a bi-monthly interview series where we go behind the screen to question process, product, and social media. Be sure to follow us on social media at KNOW Box Dance. See you next time, and don't forget to say no to the box.